So, um, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another Teamwork Criminal Space. Today, the space will be covering fairly mundane developments. We will not speak about what happened this morning. We will just do a quick um, illustration of how bad it is going for the Ukrainian armed forces, despite the flurry of videos proving that it's going bad for the Russians. Um, Generally speaking, the space today is going to be more aiming at addressing the main issue that Ukrainians have right now, which is the potential loss of Velika Novosilka and the whole Ugledar wall as we spoke. Now, if you have followed the advances south of Donetsk, you would know that we went from early February from Pretistivka to now being, according to still to be sourced reports and geolocated reports, not further than 3 kilometers from Velika Novosilka, from its east. The progression is absolutely amazing, and on that axis, it doesn't seem that it suffers any of the big bouts that we're seeing right now in Kursk, but also in Pokrovsk. If you want the best image possible of how bad it's going in South Donetsk and Pokrovsk area, we will also touch a small word about Kupiansk, but that one needs still to cook and come to fruition within 1 month to 6 weeks. But generally speaking, when you see how it's going in South Donetsk, you understand why the Ukrainians were defending Ugledar and the surrounding areas with so much anger and tenacity, and why once Ugledar fell and Perchisivka was eliminated and the advance went both north and west, the whole situation snowballed in what we have right now, which is a triple, I'd say, boiler. The worst part of the boiler actually is not even that it's tripled or whatever. It's just that it happens so fast. So roughly between 70 days, we are in the current situation. And I want to point it out so you might understand why I'm speaking. So in the picture that you're seeing, you have, first of all, the area of control as described by Deep State, and then you have three problematic situations for the Ukrainians. The first one is the south boiler, South Kotel. That one is self-explanatory. You cannot add more. Russians are cutting from Sensivka. They are reaching Uspenovka from the south, and therefore they are creating the Ilinka, Uspenovka Kotel. That one, in my opinion, is probably either already vacated by the Ukrainians, or they are willing to replay the same thing they did at Zenit early on in 2024, when, as you know, according to reports, there were between 6 and 25 people that were captured and executed there. The second aspect, which is a little bit more open and still affords some leeway to the Ukrainians, is the central Kotel, which regards the western part of Kurakovo and the projected getaway road along the Kurakovo Reservoir. That one has a huge problem, as I said, because they all are going towards the junction of the Vovcha River, actually. And then the third one, which is actually, in my opinion, the one that is absolutely already done, That's the Sonsivka Northern Kurakov Reservoir, which apparently, according to, once again, it's yet to be verified, indications, is also a little bit messed up, given that the Russians have reached Stary Terny. You remember that bridge/dam that Ukrainians blow up in order to stop the Russians from crossing the dam and cutting them from the back. Well, apparently the Russians are there. Once again, this is for the moment at the state of rumors. We will see. But as with everything, the more ridiculous rumors for the time being have been proven right within 2 to 5 days, and it's just a matter of time in this case. We will speak also about why the situation is this bad and why it announces an extremely tough uphill battle for the Ukrainians, at least when it comes to the southwestern corner of the Donetsk Oblast. Now, as you can see on the picture that I put there, there is a specific area that is marked on the map. Well, that was an area of advancement on the Russian forces. It's literally between the gray zone marked by Hope State and the area of occupation from confirmed for the Russian side. You can see the total threatened area when it's connected to the natural obstacles is roughly 350 square kilometers. The Kotel area, the boiler areas, are between 150 and 122 square kilometers, depending how you want to look at them. And those areas, in my opinion, are for at least two-thirds already done. Once again, I'm speaking about the northern Kotel, Sonsivka one, and the southern Kotel. I mean, if you were listening to Spaces, we had already explained in October that we were, as a Team War Criminal, looking forward to get the Russians at Uspenivka. Russians are almost there. Some, again, are saying that Russians see Uspenivka and the Ukrainians are moving back from the positions. I do not believe it for the moment, because so far the Ukrainians have been stupid enough to stay to the end, let's say it like this. Well, right now there is not much to say. We laid out the foundation of the explanation of the step-by-step advancements from the Russian side. And as I told you guys, if you check the location of Ugledar, which even 2 months ago seemed like a dream, given how much pain the Russians had taken from that damned area, and everybody was literally saying Ugledar needs to be salted. Well, now we are 2 months after that, and we are reaching, basically, as I told you guys, we are going beyond the 2022 line, and this is a new war. And this new war, for some reason, everybody is trying to stop it or reduce the tempo, especially on the Ukrainian side. And we have this logic of freezing the line and all this shit going on. Reality is simple. There is not going to be any freezing of the line so far, simply because the Ukrainians, as you can see on the advancement, I can put 2 comparative pictures if you want, from September to now, have no way of stopping it right now. And it has a lot to do not with any kind of mobilization, any kind of lack of weapons, lack of ammunition, lack of supplies. It has to do with the exact same thing that was being beneficial to the Ukrainians for so long, which is the very difficult approach to the area, given both former and formidable defenses, 2014, 2015, 2017, and then early 2021, 2022 defenses in the area. But most importantly is the impossibility for the Ukrainians to replace and replenish and regenerate a lot of lost things. And the most current announcement by the US side, we're going to put the Atacam's announcement on the side for a moment. It's going probably to be due for another space, but right now we're just speaking about small infantry-based, bread and butter grind things. So the latest announcement from the American side, which was gifting the Ukrainians with APERS mines, or anti-personnel mines, defensive quote-unquote anti-personnel mines. Once again, you need to know a mine is a mostly defensive tool, but once you deploy the mine doesn't become a defensive tool anymore. This is the funny part. Once it's on the ground, the mine cannot tell friend from foe, except in rare cases, of course. But the moment you deploy it, it can be as much offensive as defensive. It will only depend who's going to be stupid enough to walk over the mine. We've had Russians blow on their own mines, we have Russians blow on Ukrainian mines, and we have had, as you know, troops versus mines since the beginning of the war. So in that sense, whereas I said a mine is mostly a defensive tool, it can also become an offensive one, and this is what is being talked about recently with the APERS mines, because you can actually deploy the mines on the rear of defending troops and stop them from taking resupplies or simply evacuating the area in vehicles or even by foot. But the indication of the Americans giving them anti-personnel mines, be that scatterable or hand-placed or placed by a mechanic device, means that, and this we discussed in the group, in my opinion, that it has nothing to do with Ukrainians lacking the current mines. If you have followed Madhyar and a lot of other quote-unquote volunteer Ukrainian sources, you would notice that what they're trying to do right now is having a lot of APERS, AMAT mines, because they absolutely need to refurbish further defensive lines. And as you can see, those defensive lines do not get shorter for the moment. There is still a fuck ton of places in Ukraine to quote-unquote liberate or invade, call it as you wish. And the line of contact is only going to get shorter if the Russians advance beyond the current area of deployment in Zaporozhye. So basically, what they did right now for their own purpose, so that Ugledar wall we spoke, going to Velika Novosilka, shortened the defensive line for them. But it doesn't do so for the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians still need to cover the new salient that the Russians are forming. Of course, we can speak about a lot of things. I had a discussion with a retarded Nafuid who pretended to be a professional, who tried to discuss that from a picture those mines were diffused and stacked for other reasons. Actually, that picture told a lot more, and I was literally what I was aiming at when I discussed with him. But as usual, Nafuids are very first degree. They cannot see past the obvious. What that picture showed was Ukrainians either recycling their own mines from other fronts which are quiet right now, and we're going to speak about the Kherson front in the next space. Right now, I don't want to touch it because it's a huge discussion, and with some of the leaks that we had that allegedly Monkey would be open to cede the Nikolaev Oblast part that it had, which is basically the Kinberg speed. It's nothing, and it's not viable for Ukrainians. In return for the whole of the oblast that he's claiming, which is the Kherson Oblast and part of Zaporozhye, which is beyond the Dnieper, that needs a proper analysis, because it shows a lot more on the Monkey side. But Right now, what the Ukrainians are doing is basically taking away assets from areas they don't need to directly defend, mostly due to the fact that both sides do not have, for the moment, the appetite for risky um, cross-river pontooning, whatever you want to call it, over 100, 200, 300 meters. What most of the pontooning has been in this war it has been maximum 100, 120 meters, and a bit of rafting, a bit of fording. But for everything else, it has been almost impossible in the era of drones, FPVs, accurate long-range fires, and HIMARS, of course, when we're not speaking about Lemur, Iskander, or other nasty shit. So, for the Ukrainians right now, those mines that are going to come from the US are there to help them out, lay out defensive lines further east, and because of the length of the front doesn't get very shorter for them, actually it gets longer, given that they now need to have another salient. And as you know, a salient is always a problem for both sides, but it's mostly a problem for the defensive side if they don't have the material and supplies and manpower required to defend the salient properly. One such situation is the Pokrovsk kist, let's call it like that, or the Pokrovsk flower, or the Ocheretina flower, and so forth and so on, which was very small, should have been defensible, and well, it resulted into something extremely negative for the Ukrainians, with this whole overture of roughly 1,200 kilometers on that area, plus the other 800 kilometers that they lost along the Ugledar, Velika Novosilka line, and then plus some losses in Kupiansk and so on, which made roughly 2,300 square kilometers for this year. Well, also not forgetting that they're losing square kilometers in Kursk, which means that in total, Ukrainians would have gone in a roughly negative 2,300-400, given that the Kursk advance has been far more than half. The real occupied terrain in Kursk should be between 300 and 400 square kilometers, despite what Deep State is notifying. But anyway, that's not important. Right now, the area that has been seized by the Russians is not important, even though it's far more accelerating than it was 3, 5, 6 months ago. The reality and what you need to follow is not how much ground they've taken. It is how badly the Ukrainian defenses have been faring. One of these situations was a recent commentary from a fighter of the Karadag Brigade. As you may remember, the Karadag Brigade was sent in the area of Selidovo, Mihailovka, to stop the Russians from taking the city. And after some cool videos, in about 2 weeks, end of August, early September, the Karadag Brigade stopped posting actual good news, and they started complaining. And finally, well, as you know, Selidovo was taken, and ironically, it was taken exactly as we described it. So basically, Vishneve cut advancing troops from the back, and then come everything from the north, and cut the city in half, and so on and so forth. So basically, the thing with the Ukrainians right now, I used Karadag as an illustration. The thing with the Ukrainians right now is that they do not have an answer, tactically, technically, and also intellectually, to the Russian onslaught. And this is the most important part. Despite the fact that we don't like them at Timor criminal, Ukrainians always had some kind of intellectual answer. And that intellectual answer was, acquiring and employing massively FPVs, acquiring Baba Yagas, which they are doing that, but the way they would employ them meant that there was a logic behind it, an evolution, a vision on what they wanted to do with it. But since roughly May 2024, there is none of it. There is a present stagnation. The tactics employed are the same. They are costing them more people on defense, and also, given some recent happenings, tornado strikes, Iskander strikes on outposts, especially around the Sumy Kursk area, are showing the limits of as I said, the intellectual response. The other things that are visible with the intellectual issue are the fact that the Ukrainians seem to have a huge problem adapting to the Russians. And every time we see these guys get into quote-unquote boilers, hotels, we always ask at Timor criminal, but now we stopped asking, by the way. We know that the Ukrainians were going to do it because there is a martyrdom concept that is being pressed up among the Ukrainians against their own will, mostly. And that Karadag interview, I'm going to find it again, it's in the internal group, but it's literally that. It's basically what foot soldiers, but also other people are saying within Ukrainians, is that we have commanders that are worse than the Russian commanders because they are committing the same mistakes, even worse, but they are in defense, which means that there is nowhere to run behind you. I'm just going to use again a sport analogy for everybody who has played football, not the handek, but the European one, although the handek works the same. When you're a defender and you have a launched forward on your lane, you have only one choice: beating him at speed, or defending by taking him out the ball. You know. But in this case, what happens mostly is that a neglect on the positions, but also a lack of vista on what the Russians wants to do. Because this is the thing with this war. For a long while, I blamed the USSR fully for the situations that the Russians got themselves into. We're speaking purely tactical. The planning, the overall strategy, that's something else, and I will always blame the Russians for going for something that was antinomic. But it doesn't really fucking matter by now. It's done. It's the past. 2022, 2023 are gone. We're speaking about end of 2024. But then I changed my mind. I said, well, the Ukrainians are adapting to the Russians, and it seems pretty obvious that they're starting to know each other. Well, since May 2024, I've started to doubt that. I really think that while the Ukrainians are yapping a lot about Russian junior officer or medium-level CO losses, they are completely forgetting they're losing just the same. And proportionally, it hits them harder. Because at the onset, we can refer back to what Monke had posted in March 2022, the 9th March 2022, to the Ukrainian delegation, when it asked that the officer corps of the Ukrainian military dropped from 7,500 to 1,500. This was, as many people pointed out back then, dropping from a full to a fifth of the, so 20% of the officer corps. Back then, I also had posted a graphic which showed that the Ukrainian armed forces had roughly about 5,400, 5,500 active officers, which were basically overseeing active troops. And this logic put those officers at roughly 53 to 55 officers per 1,000 troops. Wasn't bad, wasn't good, but it didn't really matter because back then, in 2022, the officer loss, which was still high, was, coped by the voluntary mobilization, the patriotic feeling to defend its own country. Fast forward in 2023, You remember that we mocked how the officer selection worked on the Ukrainian side, and we ended up with completely nut jobs like Marcus and all the cretinoids of the 47, but not only, basically all the new brigades had wackos as commanding officers. Then we learned about Krinky recently when we saw Yuri Sodol being an absolute, you know, shit and garbage for a human. But we have had the same for the Russian side as well. I mean, the most recent situation with the Siversk front, but also other officers. People were complaining about Magomedov around Ugledar and so forth. But once you analyze this stuff, you understand that it has nothing to do with how good or bad an officer is. It has mostly to do with how the officer evolves within the war he's fighting. And unfortunately, on both sides, a lot of officers have not evolved from 2022. A lot of Russian officers, especially the mid to higher echelon, become extremely casualty adverse. You're going to look at me like, what the fuck do you say? Trust me, they have become a lot more casualty adverse than before. One of the cop-outs that they had was, well, basically what Prigozhin did, which was creating the storm groups by grabbing Zeks out of prison. This unfortunately made it extremely easy for a lot of people, explicitly Wagner, to burn through troops and burn through casualties because basically those people didn't matter. It's absolutely awful what I'm saying, but it has to be said. But the Ukrainian side doesn't have this. On the Ukrainian side, I think post-Bakhmut, there was a deep and definitive trauma which followed what happened in 2022, where they were completely in utter dominance. Intellectually, ISR was there, long fires, tactical long fires. Ukrainians in September, November 2022 were so much at the peak of their game, completely ignoring that most of it was made possible by US and Western influx, that they planned and gamed everything as if the war was going to stay the same. But what I am trying to explain here is that the war changed strictly and definitely at the end of 2022. And Ukrainians never adapted to that reality. They found gimmicks, so we have the drones, we have the distance mining, we have the very cool usage of propaganda, which is mostly gore, to the narrative out of it. One of these very nice narratives was the most recent assault on Dalny. I want to come to this assault because it literally embodies how the Ukrainians have become good at it, were good at it, but even there, they've started to fall off. Now in Dalny, you probably saw the footage about these Leopard ambushing a column of Russian vehicles and damaging at least two, including one tank that seemed to have been completely taken out of combat, and at least one IFV. With the group, we have a master autist, our friend Prizrak, and we were fucking scratching our heads like, okay, it's Dalny, fine, but where does this ambush come from? And I'm going to post you the location of the situation because it's pretty funny. And it tells a very long story. And this story is exactly why the Ukrainians are losing, actually. First of all, as you may know, within 3 days we understood that Dalny was lost, despite the quote-unquote wonderful ambush. But the ambush itself was, and I'm going to repeat it, actually a failure. People are going to say, oh, you're coping and all this shit. I'm like, nah, I have no problem with that. If you want to call that cope, call that cope. I don't have anything. So I'm adding two pictures. First of all is the my read on how the quote unquote ambush happened is based on a topographic map. The red is the height, and the pale colors, yellow, green, teal, you got the low. The two stars are what we discovered quickly enough is that there wasn't one leopard, but there were two. Although one leopard engaged the column, was quickly seen. He basically unloaded 3 to 4 shots. With the cutouts, you seem to think that he unloaded like 7 to 8 shots. And he attacked the two front vehicles, which happened to be both of them tanks, T-tanks, T-72Bs and T-80BVs. Both of the tanks, according to what we had as after action pictures, were grazed. The reactive armor actually worked, and well, I still have my doubts about those pictures, but if we take them at face value, it would perfectly work with what happened. So first picture is basically where the tank was located, only one tank, because the second tank is completely on the back. If you see the second picture I posted, you're gonna see that you have 3 stars on the second picture. The most eastern star is where the tank got out. There is a video that had been actually filmed by the Russians. That tank actually enters combat and exits combat from roughly 16:15, so 4 p.m., a quarter past 4 p.m., and ends up getting lanceted on the position that you're going to see in the middle of the picture at 16:41 or 16:47, depending. I'm not sure, but it's 16:41. If that tank probably starts firing, so basically the position where he's at is pointed there because they probably were thinking that the tank would be, if you see the line, the tanks would be going fairly north, so on the low ground, straight ahead on the area northeast of Dalny, and they were going to cut the road between Kurakovo and Dalny. The position of the tank, when you see there, is fine with a defilade attack. With a defilade attack, that tank would have been majorly devastating the column. And actually, a former footage of another such case shows defilade hits on IVs, but that one was supposed to be 2 days before this contact. I do think that contact actually and this contact were the same. It was a longer engagement where those 2 tanks, or 3 tanks, but I think 2, hit between 5 and 8 vehicles, taking out 2 to 4 of them. Anyway, that's not important. What is important is that what initially started as a defilade attack or defilade ambush ended up by being an enfilade ambush. And that's why you see that initially the tank was on the first picture, so basically where you have the the colors with the topographic map. So the left star was the initial position. As you can see, if it was a defilade, so if the tanks and the vehicles, Russian vehicles, were up north on the second line, would have been perfect. It would have hit the tanks and the vehicles without the problem. But because they were further south on the height, this makes the tank's job a bit easier because the vehicles are silhouetted, they're crested, but they're also covered by a row of trees, and you're gonna see that the gap to fire to those vehicles is extremely small, probably between 100 and 300 meters, depending on depth of the position. So what happened is that the tank couldn't hit as many vehicles as it should have hit, and is facing the whole column head on, which is in enfilade. This situation made it impossible for that tank to actually exploit the advantageous position, although I'm going to repeat, on a purely topographic situation, it was completely shit because it was on the low ground. But he was also expecting the Russians, to follow up on the rather low ground and expose the flank. So one Leopard does that, fires a couple of shots, then sees that, oh my god, I'm having everybody going to me. And the Ukrainians cut this so beautifully that you think that thing is wasting Russians one after the other, and the Russians are going to be wasted and destroyed. Then comes the Lancet footage when we see that the tank that starts to, fire, as I said, between 4:15 p.m. until roughly 4:30. Then he tries to get the fuck out. And when you see the distance that the tank tries to go through by hiding, waiting, and the place where the Lancet gets it, which is, as I told you guys, is in the dead center of the next picture, then you understand exactly what's going on. The gap of that time is the time to fly to the actual Lancet. And the Lancet hits the tank about 11 minutes from the moment the tank is detected going out of that, firing position it had. That leaves us, a detection time that we will see for the next tank, which gets hit roughly also at 5:11, 5:17. Both detection and strike times on the Lancet timer show about 11 minutes. This means that the attacking crew, was roughly between 15 and 20 kilometers away. And it was the same crew. But those two tanks that Ukrainians showed, liberating or fending off an attack, when you locate them being hit by Lancets, what you understand is those two tanks were just there to try and slow down the attack. They had already lost. They were not going to make it, especially when you see them after the Lancet attack. And this is what I wanted to point out, that once you see that you're going to engage Leopards, two of them, against a Russian column, but you are deploying them as some kind of system, which the first one will try to put a lot of hurt on the column of the Russians coming through, and the second one is going to come and mop out whatever is there. You understand what the problem is. The problem is that if something goes wrong, you're going to lose both tanks. And guess what happened? Both tanks got hit by Lancets. One absolutely gone. You could see charring signs on top of the hatch, smoke going out of there, and also, most importantly, you can see that both hatches, tank commander, gunner, and loader, are open. Therefore, the tank has been abandoned while smoking. The second tank is seen being hit after, being on movement, and after about 50-60 meters, it stops, and the tank is smoking as well. In both cases, those images weren't shown by the Ukrainians, of course not. They were shown by the Russians, but once you put everything inside, you understand the futility of the approach. But you also understand the problem, which sees Ukrainians sacrifice two of their most prized vehicles. And yes, Leopard 2 A4s are a fuck ton of price for the Russians, simply because it was deemed absolutely crucial to stop the Russians from taking Dalny. Now, fast forward 2 days after, And Deep State confirms that the advance on Dalny that was supposedly beaten. Deep State even posted some bullshit about how every single guy within Dalny was dead. Deep State posts that Dalny is not only isolated from Ukrainian forces, so basically the Russians have the advantage there, but we see that Dalny is completely taken. And once you see the map, and I'm going to refer to the first map that I posted, once you see the map, Dalny is between Uspenivka and Kurakovo. You see that Dalny cuts the whole defensive line. And we see exactly what I told you guys. Exactly what Timur Criminal understood from the beginning. The whole area from Pokrovsk to Kurakovo and down to Ugledar, which would mean this huge front of 60 kilometers in length, was first cut in smaller pieces. And you can see it here. Russians created smaller hotels for Ukrainians to get themselves inside. And then they try to eliminate. This approach is not new. We've seen this done by the Russians for the last 3 years. Not enough for us Ziggers, but still it's nothing new. And the fact that Ukrainians cannot counter this, despite the fact that they are employing some of their most prized units, reeks of only one thing. And we can, try to be adult about this and try not to brag about this, but it is simply desperation. These guys are putting so much hurt on the attacking Russian forces in Kursk by employing up to 200 drones for an attack of about 15 vehicles. But unfortunately, they don't have those 200 drones to defend a crucial situation like Dalny, which, as I told you guys, cut the front in two, made it easier now for the Russians to pick each side separately, and is forcing the Ukrainians to get the fuck out of Kurakovo, which is an absolute monster move. This reeks of a lack of seriousness within the Ukrainian defense forces, because what we had initially for the Russians, which is still there, by the way, this war is eminently political, let's not be fooled by that. But for some reasons, since a while, the political side has given a almost blank check to the military. And the military, despite a lot of issues on the Russian side, is delivering. And the blows that you're seeing right now on the Russian side, they are hitting, as I told you, the most crucial and delicate and vulnerable points of the Ukrainian defense line. Once Velika Novosilka is done and the guys are going to go to Ivanovka, which is roughly 30 kilometers northwest, the wall will be complete. You're going to have a 50-kilometer wall, 5-0, and it's going to be a huge salient in southern Donetsk. That salient created, that wall created, means that you are not attacking Zaporozhye anymore without reducing this salient first. This is simple. This is a bunch of nobodies sitting, looking at a map, looking at topography, looking at whatever was done, and saying, guys, you have a problem. Let's not remember what was said before, because it would be stupid from most of the pro-troops and the Chuba pushers. Remember that there was nothing strategic that had happened yet. No strategic breakthrough in southern Donbass. Everything was fine. Oh, some, localized pushes, but nothing severe. Well, I'm going to post you a picture so you can start understanding, although I've already said this now by a fucking mile, and I'm getting disgusted by myself, because not understanding this, although I'm pretty sure that the Piger OKW is understanding this without the problem, but not understanding this, I'm sorry to say, guys, but it's fucking criminal. So, This is the current situation, and where the wall is gonna go. This is the first picture, guys. Of course, it's a huge fucking gamble on the Russian side, and that salient would need to be fortified with a push northeast. But it's self-explanatory. So, I posted both the pictures you can see, and the problem with this, it's not even that, as I told you, you cannot see it. It's not something new. There is nothing that hasn't been, spoken about before. You got the both pictures now. No, what you're seeing, it's like the basics of operational tactics and strategic thinking. There is nothing there, If you see the second picture, you're gonna see that the advance reaching Ivanovka up there literally puts the Ukrainians in front of a huge dilemma, because that salient that's going slowly towards Prosiana and Pokrovsk is going to force the Ukrainians to have to divide the forces or concentrate on the salient. But this is the advantage that the Russians are going to have. For the Ukrainians right now, they do not have the forces, so that salient going forward is going to stretch to a point of rupture. The elasticity of the Ukrainian defense right now is bad. We are, once again, not even speaking about Toretsk, we are not even speaking about Chasov Yar, we are not speaking about Kupiansk. We are just speaking about South Donetsk. If we have to put Pokrovsk into the game, it would be even worse. But as I said, this is just purely what's going on right now, and why, as I told you, I am more and more thinking that the losses incurred by the Ukrainian forces in the late 2022, all 23, especially on the officer corps, have led to a subpar replacement. Once again, I'm not saying that the Russians haven't got the same problem. Quite the contrary. I think that on that aspect, both of the sides fighting right now have that exact problem, with one huge difference. The size of the Ukrainian army prior to the war wasn't conducive to a large officer corps. The total officer corps, with instructors, with retirees, with the parade officer, the observant officer, so basically people who had the any kind of grade up to a certain point within quote-unquote democratic Ukraine, was maybe 20,000 people. So if you want to put back people on, you were extremely limited, because out of those 20,000 people, maybe half were fucking pensioners. Having them start to talk about Starlink, FPV drones, and all that stuff was useless. The other half of those 10,000, well, 7,500 was allegedly the number that was given by Putin, which, as I tell you, I honestly think that was a very good observation of the Ukrainian army back then, of its real potential. Now, the other problem that we have with the Ukrainians, as I said, this replacement never came, but also they had a huge issue, because you send people to get trained in England, where you start by options like you're going to get, a lot more bang for your buck, due to the fact that you're not going to get challenged on the sky. And initially, that's why a lot of Ukrainian conscripts, but also junior officers, were complaining about. The idea was that the Brits or whoever had no fucking clue about what was going on in Ukraine. They were all looking at these fucking huge images where Ukrainians were raining hell on Russians, and they thought that it was all fine. That Ukrainians had a lower level complete control of the skies, and they could just point their guns, their missiles, and drones and finish off the advancing Russians. But as usual, this was, I think, hurt Ukrainians the most. This was what set up the hype for the counter, which immediately was, destroyed. As I said, they tried to attack from Danilovka in March 2023. It was a complete failure. Then they started to dub it a reconnaissance by fire that went wrong, although we saw footage that would make everybody cry, because the whole fucking attack party was absolutely cream. M113s, 2 IPRs, BMPs, people that weren't picked from the ground for days. The Russians let them rot. And the more we advance, the more we are seeing from, especially on the defensive side, there is nothing. And that's why the FPV, the drone ops have taken such a huge part in the defensive system of the Ukrainian armed forces. Because conventional defense right now for them is impossible. If the FPVs aren't there to bail them out for a while, there is nothing behind. And they can keep showing, JDAMs and SDBs and HIMARS, but once you put them all together, it's getting smaller. The whole area is shrinking. And one of the biggest problems that Ukrainians have right now is not even the lack of, as I said, manpower, or the lack of supplies, or the lack of means. No, the problem is that they have entertained a defensive system all over Ukraine right now, which could only work if something like Kursk happened, but it worked. So basically, Ukrainians would go far enough, cause enough damage, especially on the, I'd say, prestige side. So cause a huge enough humiliation for the Russians, so that the Russians would completely overturn their priorities, would leave Donbass and go ham on Kursk, or whatever it would be. The issue with that is that their limited forces, force them to actually do something that was absolutely unforgivable. And I'm going to tell you what it is. It's literally you being on debt and thinking that you're going to buy back that debt by going ham with the remaining coins that you have at the casino. Kursk was a gambit. We already discussed this. But the problem is that it wasn't a safe bet by a mile. It was actually a house bet. You had already lost engaging into something like that. The chance for you to win everything back through Kursk was inexistent. The whole logic, I'm going to repeat, the more I focus on this, is the political side of the conflict on the Ukrainian part, which has always been oversized, trying to win the war for the fledgling military. The more you put things together, and you're going to, keep hearing this, the more you understand that the whole Kursk escalation on the Ukrainian side, and now we speak about North Koreans in Kursk, but we haven't seen them. Of course, it's another Viagra container, incubator story, whatever, is another bullshit to, for some kind of reaction and allow the Americans to save face by, allowing the Ukrainians to start hitting everywhere, be that in Russia or in Kursk, whatever. But the problem with this is that I told you guys again, if they didn't do anything with Toropets, and even if they didn't do anything with Voronezh, hitting in Bryansk wouldn't make any difference. We are way far gone that problem right now. it is not anymore a supply war on the ammunition or weapon side. We've seen the Koksans coming. We are seeing a couple of more Malvas. We are getting there where, you have these fluctuations of the war. At some point, a huge influx of Western weaponry, while the Russians were dipping due to their losses, helped the Ukrainians, have large successes. Then the Ukrainians themselves started dipping because they forced their advances, and actually they did something that was extremely interesting with, as I said, Kherson and Kharkov, but those were low-hanging fruits. And when, the going got tough, the Ukrainians simply stopped going. The counter was a failure. Then the Russian strategic offensive over Donbass crushed them, despite, I'm going to repeat, despite all the horrible images that you saw, despite everything that Ukrainians posted by, we killed so many Russians, it didn't matter. Because the point for the Russians was that once we break through, it was going to become a numbers matter, and the Ukrainians had never recovered from even Bakhmut. Not saying about the counter, not saying about the early Avdiivka stage. I'm just saying Bakhmut. And you cannot even blame Zelensky for that. We had the discussion multiple times within the group. The problem with Ukraine is the state of the country prior to the war. And we're not speaking 1422, we are speaking 9122. Ukraine mismanaged massively its population, its wealth, and its structure. Was there a Russian hand in there? Who the fuck cares? We can use the same excuse on the Russian side by saying, oh, there are NATO guys helping, which is still true. But right now, the point is that despite everything on both sides, it boils down to a face-off between Ukrainians with all their shortcomings and their advantages against the Russians with their own shortcomings and their advantages. And it boils down to the Ukrainians sending a mix of Storm Shadows and HIMARS on a fucking 19th century estate that is allegedly a fucking underground bunker. And the Russians replying with something that we don't know what it is, even if it's becoming more and more obvious that it is a ballistic missile of medium range or a mix of systems that could be Iranian Russian or fully Russian, but that shows the fucking difference in level between a proxy, Ukraine, and a player, Russia. And of course, what do we hear from the Ukrainians after they were so funny and so happy and bashing the Russians with, oh, now we're gonna fucking smoke you with Atacams and Storm Shadows? We hear, oh my god, you used ICBMs on civilians. I'm like, bitch, the 3 strikes you did so far had no regard for civilian lives. One was the estate, as we said. The other one was allegedly a arsenal. When we saw that civilians from the videos, although those need to be verified, we saw a negative effect on the civilians as well. So I'm not really interested in hearing anyone trying to tell me oh, but see, Ukrainians doing this, Russians doing that, but one side and the other. The Taran theorem with Ukrainians, for those who don't know, Taran theorem is that Ukrainians accusing Russians or mocking Russians for something and they're getting twice as bad up their asses. It's a long story, but for people who don't know, just check down theorem, you're gonna have some fun. But exactly what's going on right now is that Ukrainians are trying to escalate a war, which I've said this before, they cannot up-escalate Russia. And on top of it, we got back to what I told you guys. First of all, I want to brag a little bit. I told you that the solution would be nuking Dnipropetrovsk, and the choice was like, it's the easiest thing to do. It's a huge ass city, a lot of industrial potential there, a probable target of the Russian forces within 2025, 2026 if the war keeps going. And also, it is the cornerstone of the Ukrainian identity because it's literally the city on the Dnieper. So the full gamut of symbolic but also objective significations were in Dnipropetrovsk. So Monkey literally said, fuck this, I'm making a mock nuke attack on that city. And as we saw it live, there was nothing to stop that thing from obliterating Ukraine. But once again, the Ukrainians are not going to understand this. And that's why I'm getting from the intellectual downturn on the Ukrainian side. Right now, those people are not ready to accept they've lost. They are still, hanging to this thread that the Russian economy is going to go wrong and Russians are going to start eating grass. And I'm like, my friend, it doesn't change a shit. Your biggest problem right now is not that Russians pay 73% more for potatoes. Your problem is that you cannot pay for potatoes without Western aid. You're the beggars. You don't have that economy anymore. And on top of it, the demonstration the Russians did is a full gamut. First of all, we can hit you whenever we want. Second of all, in the recent days, you might have seen that a couple of attacks were extremely lethal, but also were showing the seriousness of Monkey. The attack on the Kremenchuk dam, which worked with the three cruise missiles that we saw in action, worked, as I said, both on the turbine row, but also were impacting the dam with a hydraulic Fox effect. That hydraulic Fox effect is, as I said, blowing the foundation or impairing them by blunt force. So you're going to have to start thinking about seepage. And as I said, the problem with that thing happening is that you will be also forced to drop the water level, therefore have less production of electricity. Although, once again, the group has pointed out that the hydro central production of electricity is rather low. The real idea behind the strike was to hint that we're going to make that dam fail and you're going to have a flooding episode, which is going to be extremely serious. We're speaking, as I said, I spoke in the group, and I know that a couple of guys probably were very surprised, shocked, or I don't know, to learn that if that thing happens within 45 minutes, you're going to have a huge ass area just after Kremenchuk completely flooded going down south, and that the risks affecting between 5 and 10,000 people, potentially, if it goes fast enough, killing them all. You're going to have a mass casualty event with multiple Ks. Not 100, not 200, not what happened with Kakova, where I think 112 people died, including a couple of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers. No, this thing is going to be the real one. And given the position of the Kremenchuk dam, the downstream washup is risking to cause far more damage down to Kaniv and under. You are looking at something that indicates we're not stupid, but unfortunately Zelensky has nothing to do with a sane leader anymore. His logic is, and Big Serge said it, fight to a knife, knife to a hilt. That's it. Right now, the Ukrainian political leadership doesn't want to give up, doesn't want to negotiate because they understand they are in such a weak position, but also doesn't see any other way than escalating. And in a certain sense, despite everything that has been said so far, that, Bandera is not much, they are joining this fucking absurd ideology where you got Stepan Bandera saying that millions should be ready to die for the idea of Ukraine. And this thing is being done not because millions are ready to die, but it's being done because some idiot right now in Washington and another idiot in Brussels have no problem dealing with Ukrainian lives. Russian as well, but those are supposed to be Ukraine's friends. So once you see to this political and military situation from the Ukrainian perspective, and you have so many small details that are going against them, like they have doubled the Amatol round production, those Amatol rounds are failing, we had multiple mortar rounds, multiple mortar round batches going wrong. There was a very funny video I think I posted with a mortar that basically burnt inside the tube, expanded the tube and got stuck. Another video that shows the mortar being thrown like 20-30 meters away and not even exploding. We have issues with fuses. At the same time, we got Madhyar posting videos on how his fucking mines are great. And this is also the other point I was saying. Ukrainians are still trying to find salute into a techno-messiah. They are forgetting what the fucking war is about, ultimately. Ultimately, the war is about 10 guys taking over 2 guys, and even if they lose 5, the 2 guys gonna be dead. And the 2 guys' possessions, including wife, daughter, children, are gonna be to the 5 guys that survive on the other team. If you go the road that Zelensky is trying to push out, which is, once again, fight to the knife, knife to the hilt. And this is a huge problem that everyone should understand. This is not being concerned by the Ukrainian population and that they survive or not. This is being concerned by the fact that while the Ukrainian leadership is lacking self-preservation instincts, around them it's not going to be like this. And the threshold of violence and loss and destruction is not obvious yet. So we've had discussions about how the West is going to intervene and send troops in Ukraine if the Russians reach Pavlograd. Other people have said about defending the western bank of the Dnieper. And you're like, this is nonsense. Because the moment you divide Ukraine in 2, there is no Ukraine anymore. And that division would mean, I'm going to repeat it once again, it doesn't mean Eastern Ukraine versus Western Ukraine. It doesn't matter, because it's Russia against Ukraine, and it's Russia against the Rum state. So the whole point of failing to have the Ukrainians understand their situation and pressure them enough based on, at some point the Russians are going to lose momentum and we're going to go back is absolutely ignoring the very state of the Ukrainian military right now. And maybe we're wrong, and maybe this is a huge play by the Ukrainians, willing to, attract the Russians to the point when they're going to have a successful counter. But given how far the Russians went with Dnipropetrovsk, I think that's a bluff. I think that Ukrainians right now are trying to sell something they are not. I think the Ukrainians right now are a Potemkin army trying to cover everything. Is like that the guy who has a fuck ton of debts but still goes on to fill half a tank of his Jaguar and still dresses nicely and pretends he has deals, but hopes every single day that a tire won't blow off, because then, everything's gonna domino. We can say the same about the Russians with how the economy is being described by a lot of people. Although even them, they agree that it's not gonna happen in short term. So the best case scenario is a race to the bottom for both sides. And the worst case scenario is that Ukraine is already at the bottom. And what they're doing right now, they're digging beyond that. But the situation for the Ukrainians is that if they dig beyond that bottom, there is no coming back for what they want to achieve by this resistance. And I'm hearing a lot of people trying to praise Zelensky for not putting more youngsters in harm's way. I'm like, he has no choice. The people he's supposed to, put under the flag, they are not even 200,000. There is nothing to actually enlist. They're asking for 450, 500,000 in total. They've managed about 130,000. Let's be generous with them. They need another 160,000 according to Nayem, and another 250,000 next year. The bodies are just not there. On top of it, they are lying on the losses. They are lying on so many things. And I'm not saying the Russians aren't doing that as well. But the point is not that. The point is that the guy who has less needs to lie less, needs to be a lot more serious. And this puts us and brings us to the same issue we had with Ukraine since the beginning, which is demonstrated by the slow collapse of the southern Donetsk front. Ukraine was led to lie. Ukraine was allowed to lie, was allowed to pretend things were fine until the point when it got completely offhand with the situation regarding the Republicans with their border bill, and then the Israeli happening. And we are here now where everybody's asking themselves, listen guys, you have now ammunition. You have a lot more than you ever had before. And you're supposed to have every single tool in the box to, at least stop the Russians. But the only thing they did was go to Kursk and waste a shit ton of goods. And we already said that maybe the point was to go to Kursk because they would be more efficient and they would get more bang for the buck in Kursk than trying to engage them in Donbass and simply lose them into a senseless defense. And I'm going to go back to the engagement in Dalne. That shows perfectly that you can give the Ukrainians whatever you want. If they're not able to see the situation happening, you're just going to end up with very expensive losses. Those two Leopards. Leopards were hit and lost. Dalne was lost the very same day. And now the Russians have tactically cut the communication between Kurakovo and Uspenivka, and you are in the shit. Because now they get to choose which sides they want to paralyze. If they're smart, they go for Uspenivka and they corral Ukrainians out of Krakow and hit them with FPVs, artillery, whatever. If they're a bit more in a hurry, they do both sides. If they want to humiliate Ukrainians, then they do Krakow first and try and trap as many people as they can there, and we're gonna have surrender or TWK images like the ones we had in Kursk more recently. So generally speaking, what we are seeing right now on the Ukrainian side is not only, as I said, just a material problem, and by material I also mean manpower. No, I think it's a general lack of self-questioning. A lot of people are going to say, yeah, it's the hype of 2022. I do not believe it. I think that their vision, this is one thing that Zaluzhny said, and I mocked, and I still mock, but apparently Ukrainians are going there, which was that we cannot face the Russians on manpower alone. We need to have some kind of force multiplier, technological force multiplier. But that's the problem. It's not, as I told you guys a year before, it's not a Zulu war. Russians are not some aboriginals with spears and shovels. What you're going to send them, you're going to get back within weeks, even months at worst case scenario. So any kind of technological advantage would require the numbers, so manpower, but also industrial power, which Ukraine doesn't have. And through discussions with a lot of stupid people recently, most of them NATO, you understand and you see that what is remaining for the Ukrainian side is a intervention. There is nothing else. Because even a quote-unquote air campaign would just be reduced to then Russians trying to exchange Iskander, God forbidding, nuclear-tipped ones, to American, German, Polish, whatever base. It's clear at this point that the Americans do not want it. It's also clear at this point that Biden is poisoning the well before leaving. Therefore, make it impossible, and Trump has nothing to do there. I'm literally speaking only between Russians and Ukrainians. It is making it impossible for these two parties to come together without a military decision on a specific area of the front. And this military decision, unfortunately, seems to be the whole Donetsk Oblast, which means that peace will only be possible when the Russians will have Pokrovsk, the extension towards Kharkov, so basically to Novoalexandrivka, the sister cities, or at least to a point where you're threatening them. Given what's going on in Chasov Yar, they're not far from them. On the other side, let's not forget that Kupiansk, the whole situation right now is purely tactical, because if we have to follow up on what Monke said, Kharkov is not to be touched. So the whole 3, 4, 5% of Kharkov Oblast that has been controlled by the Russians right now will have to be given back. And therefore, once you do this calculus, you understand that it's the Ukrainians who don't have time, who don't have the bodies, who also have a huge problem with the escalation ladder. That means, I'm going to repeat it to you guys, that means that right now, one side knows what it wants, and that's the minima of the Russian side, which is opening negotiations once the whole Donetsk Oblast is done. because that would also push the Lugansk Oblast to be cleared. But then we have the Ukrainian side, which is seeing every single day its positions being completely cleared out, and even its gambits going to dust. If you take these two positions outside of their respective ecosystems, so basically the promise of about $110 billion worth of military and humanitarian aid and grants for the state functioning, and on the other side, the problems on the Russian side with hydrocarbon sales and new markets which are being challenged. That's the thing. Right now, what the Americans are still going to try and do is challenge the marketization, the sales of the Russian products, be that hydrocarbons or minerals, metalwork, and so on. Once you take them out of their ecosystems and their, idiosyncrasies, you are seeing that on one side, the Ukrainians are feeling that they're going down. Therefore, you cannot have, for the moment, because they are in one of those 5 stages, they probably are in denial still. Hopefully they go through up to the bargaining phase. You cannot believe that Ukrainians, being in the mental state they are right now, especially after Dnipro, they can take clear and logical decisions. I mean, even if you know that the Russians didn't put nuclear warheads to the latest attack, what if? The whole situation with the Russian red lines was that they were mocked. They were winning, and the Americans were upping the ante, saying, oh, you know what? We're going to return this. Oh, we're going to hurt the Russians. And at no point there has been an acknowledgement from the American side by saying, okay, we fucked up, Ukraine has lost. And everybody, you can come at me and say, yeah, but you see, they're trying to start negotiations. Which negotiation talk right now has pointed out that Ukraine is losing? What you're hearing most of the time is that the situation is dire, Russians are advancing. It starts by recognizing that right now Ukraine doesn't have a single chance on a conventional phase without, as I said, an intervention or a nuke attack. But the nuke attack cannot be done by Ukraine because you would need a overwhelming attack, like at least 200 delivery systems. There is none of that. On top of the fact that once Ukraine does that, well, I mean, you can consider it completely gone. You have one shot. If you come at the Tsar, you better not miss. So how would you like the Ukrainians with this mental impediment and having the retired court behind them, just exploiting them for something that makes less and less sense? What advantage is the US gonna take out from a completely martialized Russia, having no problem popping out ICBM or even fucking MRBM? It makes fucking no sense to me. Because the more you analyze the move with the Atacams and Storm Shadows, the more you understand that it will not change anything on the Ukrainian side. It's just a political hurdle and a political game within the security infrastructure that these guys try to sell us willing to protect. To me, as I said, it makes no fucking sense. It makes no fucking sense what they're trying to do, because there is no sense to be found in there. There is nothing that you can say, oh, you know what happened? Everything was fine, we were good and great, and suddenly it went off the rails. No, we are seeing this since the Russian mobilization, and I promised this. The whole fucking team promised that to you. It's just a fucking critical mass situation. And everybody kept saying, no, GDP is gonna prevail, this is gonna prevail. No, at some point, even if tomorrow you got a Abrams tank built every day for Ukraine, it's the Ukrainians that you have that are not available for what you want to do with them. So once you get back to the initial point of this space, which is a slow but certain erosion of the Ukrainian position, what remains to be said is that it's going to get worse for everyone, because the first thing the Ukrainians are going to do now is lash out. And internally I said that I was expecting an attack on Bryansk, maybe not at the arsenal itself, but I was expecting an attack on Bryansk on multiple formation academies, the airfield over there, and also important technological enterprises, even though they have little to do with the war in Ukraine, simply because the Ukrainians cannot be trusted with the geographical limitations. One of them was you should not attack beyond Kursk, allegedly, of course. Although I don't believe the moment you say to the Ukrainians you can fire on Russia, they're gonna hear only that. All the rest, the small fine print, they're not gonna hear it. But we are into a situation where, okay, they're gonna start spamming it, which is gonna require an actual reply by the Russians, which is not gonna be ICBM, of course. But they already pointed out, we're gonna fucking blow your dams. And that was the biggest problem. The bridges are important over Dnieper, but the dams are worse. Because by opening those dams, you make the bridges even more precious. If you enlarge the embankment on the Dnieper by 2 to 3 kilometers for each side, you force the people there to use the bridges even more, because you don't have places where you can have your fording situation and everything. And because the dams are gone, you're also going to lose an extra generation capacity, but also a structural crossing that was generally better than the bridges, because the dam was supposed to be a bridge in itself, but a lot more resistant than some bridges. If you look at the most recent bridge in Zaporozhye, you'll see it's a very light structure and can be taken out by 1 or 2 Iskanders. Still not happening. But taking out the dam, damaging it enough so you can stop the circulation of anything, trains, cars, whatever, that changes completely your logic, because every single dam has at least a road on it, but they also have a railroad on it. And we're closely going to that point where the Russians are going to be forced to do something about not only the Ukrainian military, but simply the Ukrainian as an entity, as a polity. So far, it was the energetic sector, and everybody was like, let them freeze. In a certain sense, it didn't really matter because, if it's just surviving the winter, they were always going to find a way. Um, Especially if you had the Western nations starting to uh, foot the bill. But starting to damage the connections, which is, as I said, the over the Dnieper crossings on the dams, the railroads, and so forth. Then you have a completely different problem because you shrink the capacity of transportation of transit between both banks. And I know people say, yeah, but bridges are easier. No, bridges are not easier. They can start, stuffing trains with shit and just use the trains for the resupply. And you're gonna do what? Especially as I said, you have those railroad bridges over the dams. But generally speaking, once the Russians are at that point, it's the performative action that would speak a lot louder than the Ukrainians started to have shortages on the eastern bank of the Dnieper. One thing that we saw is that the Ukrainians did not yap about the Kremenchuk Dam. They took it into account, but we didn't hear anything about that. And in a certain sense, it's normal because they do not want to give up that, oh my God, we are at the Russia's mercy over this situation. This, in my opinion, is suicidal because the population, the mass population, is not heeding the danger here. They're like, oh, everything's fine. It's going to be solved. Zelia is going to solve it for us. Or, at the contrary, as we're seeing with the Poles, people are starting to have major doubts about the direction of the war from Zelensky. So, on this aspect, the war itself is going better and better for the Russian side. Of course, once you analyze the change in people that want actually the war to stop, you're still gonna see that Ukrop's gonna remain Ukrop's, and they very like only one quarter or a little bit more want to make territorial concessions. But at the other side, the reality is that these are Poles. They rely on the same marathon nonsense that we are seeing every single day. You remember the footage with the guy being on Radio Svoboda being told like, oh, but on Deep State we see that your positions in Kurakova are completely shit. And then the guy just starts sputtering. And that's it. That's the problem we're having right now. The problem is that it's going to take a little more time for the Ukrainians to realize where they are for real. They already have an idea, given the mobilization, the bussification, but still, those are just extreme cases. They still remain a minority. In reality, a lot of people go there, but it's not 2022 or even 2023. People who go now to the voinkomats, to TWK, are just have given up hope. They just go there so they won't be pursued. There are, of course, a lot of people are in hiding, people that leave Ukraine, and it's a huge part, a huge amount of people that are either AWOL or simply are real deserters, because that's one of the things that we ignore about AWOL. AWOL sometimes is just a weapon used by the military leadership, and this works on both sides, by the way, to just get people to stick, quote unquote, with the plan. And unfortunately, on both sides, military regulation has been used for private feuds and for individual issues, which has led to the idea of lawlessness on both sides of the front. But at the same time, you wouldn't have the same situation if both armies were just a bunch of rags. You have a situation where both armies are slowly getting exhausted to a point, but both armies are still keeping, by and large, and this is something that uh, you know we saw immediately crack in, let's say, Iraq or in Libya, are keeping, by and large, military discipline, although it's enforced in very brutal ways. And that's also why both sides are still going on and fighting. And this is the biggest problem that we're having with Ukraine right now. Despite what was said initially at the start of the war, there still is a idea of appartenance of a Ukrainian nation, although it's not the absurd and Banderite thought. No, people think they are part of a nation and unfortunately, and a state and a territory, and unfortunately, that's also what is keeping this war going. On the other side, of course, the Russians have their own griefs, and it is going more and more to the sense we said initially at Timor Criminal, that for the Russians this war went from some kind of political gambit, but then for the military it went from there to right now a huge chunk of it being purely revenge for the losses. And let's be honest, that's the kind of army you want at this point of the war. Even though you are seeing the executions and the war crimes, that's the kind of army that you actually want. You want an army that's not fighting for some weird idea of Ruski Mir. You want an army that's fighting for getting its hands on the Dronop who killed your brother in arms, and if potentially available, putting his head on a spike or lining them up and cutting them down. I know that it sounds extremely awful, but it's just the follow-up of fighting for your brother. You know, all this theme that everybody's fighting for the next guy in the trench. Well, this is the extension of that. That was your brother. He gets killed by an asshole 50 kilometers from there, just flying a toy with a RPG head. After also doing all kinds of shit with your brother in arms. Suddenly you have moved 40 kilometers and you put your hands into a group of guys who in their phones have not so funny things for the Russians. You also find out that they are on those videos flying those drones. What happens? Revenge. So the problem that we're having right now, and I'm going to end with this, is that on one side is the ideology who keeps things together, even a very wrong one on the Ukrainian side. And the more you're advancing on the Russian side, and it's less ideology, but just pragmatism by the fact that you are fighting for your nation. Although the goals of this war have been exchanged from the Russian world, or for people who had a Russian empire in mind, or some guys who want to, relieve the Soviet Union, whatever. Now it's going to, I've lost so many, I'm going to take revenge. This makes one side extremely cynical and dangerous, which is the Russian side, and the other side starts to get oppressing. But both sides are oppressive machines, and both sides are actually very bleak places to be, because it's a war, guys. It's not Disneyland. However, as I said, given that one side is advancing and is advancing with anger, and the other side is pulling back, but starts to pull back with fear, well, you do the math, guys. It's going to lead to more bloodshed, more loss of life, and more TWK moments. But it's also at some point, as I said, one side is going to completely lose sight of its own state, and I think the Ukrainian side is going to lose it first. So they're going to do more stupid shit in order to, how can I say, compensate for the fact they are not going anywhere um, within the war. And we've heard, the Ukrops being like, oh, but if we lose, we're gonna take it out, we're gonna leash out on the Westerners who betrayed us. This is bullshit. This is nonsense. If these people want to end up like Al Qaeda guys in Europe or in America, all power to them. I mean, kids are dumb, so it's not gonna change much. But the problem, what I'm seeing here is that the more we advance in this war, the more we get back to what the title uh, of the space is, the more both sides are losing it. And that loss of grip within the reality or within the logic, because for the Russians it's going to be, as I said, a lot more cynical. But for the Ukrainians, they're going to lose grip on the reality, and they are going to end up far from being well. So what they wanted to save, in my opinion, which was the national core, everybody's speaking about saving Ukraine as a free and prosperous state, yada yada bullshit. Forcing 45, 50 years old to get onto a bus to get shredded by FPVs and Iskander and UMPKs is not how you make the nation stronger. Thank you very much for the space. I know it was a bit wishy-washy at the end, but I really wanted to convey this idea that where both sides are going in this war are two different places, and they are completely opposite to one another, but that is going to cause a lot more eyebrows for everyone that follow this space, because things are going to get a lot worse on every aspect. On top of it, given that the war is also part of political calculus in other places, for instance, the Biden-Trump logic, where allegedly Trump would have agreed upon the strikes, I find that extremely weird, given that Trump would have to negotiate a withdrawal of this and use that as some kind of bait for the Russians. Okay, I'm gonna you de-escalate and I'm gonna stop the Ukrainians from lobbing missiles at you. I do not think that Trump, now that the genie's out of the box, can do anything about that, unless he wants to lose face, because finally, for the Ukrainians, these weapons aimed at Russia and hitting Russia are going to be a Vergeltungswaffe. So basically a payback weapon, a revenge weapon. They are not going to strategically alter the situation because Russia is so fucking big and the radius of the weapons that they have is so fucking small for such a big country. They will probably do a lot of damage. I'm not even doubting this. I told you guys. But you're going to get back to the bare numbers and also to the fact that they cannot stop the Russians from inflicting pains. And we're going to go back to what was said initially, that you're going to throw 200 Storm Shadows and maybe 200 Atacams, but within 3-4 days, your whole front line is gonna get hit by 800 UMPKs. Oh, you're gonna say, but it's not comparable. That's the whole point. The problem with UMPKs is that they can completely bypass those areas you want to strike with storm showers, ATACMS, air bases, repair fields, and so on, while they're just gonna fucking lay waste on you day after day. The expense ratio for both sides when it comes to long range fires is just still not changed with or without the ATACMS. It's just once again more damage and raising the cost for the Russians, while absolutely not thinking about what the Russians are going to do to the Ukrainians, or God forbid to some place where Americans would be. But anyway, thank you very much for having me. I'm not going to take questions today. We're going to have them tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to have a larger space targeted at Trump, the weapon situation, the idea of what stands behind the fluoroblasts that Monkey wants. We're going to have a full front review, and we're going to go back to the drawing table as we did in September. Remember, I had a whole thread for that, targeting initially Kharkov, and then also we had a second thread targeting Dnipropetrovsk. Well, right now we are right there. It's 40 days to the end of the year, and we can clearly see that things are accelerating despite the fact that nobody is noticing it. And that's bad, because that means that a lot of people who have been following the war and who have been wooing the Ukrainians now are just going silently away. And the whole blue sky bullshit on Twitter, the migration, is just a huge part of these people shielding themselves from the responsibilities that they have by selling bullshit, and getting into their own echo chamber. So we're going to address that as well. Thank you very much for being here. I'm really sorry for cutting it short. It's just like, I think, for what was supposed to be a short, succinct space went again out of hand. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for being here. See you tomorrow, guys. Bye.